I can only write the book I want to write, and I can only tell the story I want to tell. And if I don't have that, then I'm not passionate. And if I'm not passionate, I'm going to write a shitty book. It's as simple as that. If you want to call me a crime writer, hey, if it sells a book, that's cool. You want to call me Irish American, if it helps me sell in Chicago, that's awesome. Throw a shamrock on it. I'm all for it. At the end of the day, if I have to be pigeonholed, I truly think of myself as an urban novelist. That's my fascination. I always write about a city. I always write urban novels, and I am fascinated, I think, at the end of the day with questions about violence, why we do it, what the repercussions are. That's my sweet spot. Most of my books are odes to sections of one city, looking at the city of Boston as a microcosm of the larger idea of the 20th century American city. I grew up in Dorchester when, we had a high crime rate in general, and then busing hit. 1974, I was 9 years old, and as the city and the neighborhoods just tore themselves to shreds. And it was a very eye-opening experience because I was old enough to see how we were treated by the establishment. I was old enough to see the violence that was going on at a street level. And all of it, there was nobody was clean. Nobody was free of blame. I wish in history that the downtrodden banded together, but they tend not to. They tend to then hate each other. So then there's a terrible history between the Irish and African Americans in this country, because the Irish were like, well, we got to be better than somebody. And that's human nature at its saddest. So very early I was aware of a certain basic inequity in the system that came from Dorchester, which made it wonderfully fertile, dramatic territory. So if you don't want to become an artist, grow up in a really boring place and grow up safe and grow up with a very well-adjusted family around you, and you'll probably have a nice life, but you won't be terribly interesting artistically. So I always thank God for it. I thank everybody for it. I'm like, thank you. What a wonderful way to grow up, in my opinion. And certainly I'm not going to whitewash it. It was a terrible way too, but it was at a dramatic level in terms of material for the rest of my life. It was great. My best friend and I, whose name is coincidentally Bubba, we'd been best friends since we were, I think, 6. I think we were 11 at this point. And we had to have a fight. We finally had to have a fight. It's been 5 years in the making. And it was huge. It was a Donnybrook. It spanned 9 blocks. It just kept going, and there was a gang of kids surrounding us. And so these police officers came by, and they said, basically knock this off. And then they left. And we started up again once we got the all clear, and they came back. And they were very, very pissed off because you were supposed to respect the badge. So they threw us in their car and they drove us home. And they dropped Bubba off first, and then they dropped me off and got out of the car and they drove away. And my mother said, what was that car that dropped you off? So it was the police, She said, what are the police doing dealing with this, and this is ridiculous. Why would they stop 2 little boys having a fight? It's ridiculous. What were their badge numbers? And I said I never saw a badge. And the look on her face was just stricken. And I never forgot it. It stayed with me forever. It stayed with me until I wrote Mr. Quiver. And the look was, you can train your kid to do everything. We were certainly trained. We were inner city kids with a serious mistrust of authority, and we were brought up with it. So we weren't the type of kids who would easily fall victim to this. And we didn't fall victim to anything, but in the heat of the moment, when faced with authority, we got in the car and we didn't think. And it's just one of those things. I never forgot to look on my mother's face. And so for years it was always like, what if that had gone wrong? What if that had gone wrong? And then when I started Mr. Quiver, it started with this idea of, what if that had gone wrong? I truly despise this in human nature, probably more than anything. You see it in trials of rape victims. You see it in the way people look at child molestation victims. There's a slight, well, I wouldn't have gotten into that. Nobody accepts that it's all luck. that it's all lottery. You won the parental lottery, you won the neighborhood lottery, you won whatever. You won just that you were in the right place at the right time as opposed to the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's what you see in victims of abuse all the time. They're doubly abused. They're abused once by the abuser, then they're abused by people's reactions, social reaction. And so I always felt like that was the case right there. What separated me from a victim? Luck, absolute luck. And that's what separates Dave from Sean and Jimmy. And one of the things I did with Mystic River that I wanted to do, I never wanted to use the term survivor's guilt, never once. I never wanted to show up in the text. But that's absolutely what haunts Sean and Jimmy. They've never gotten past it. They never got past not getting in the car. Dave never gets over getting in the car. So that's it. Violence against children was something that I think shows up in my work a lot because there's a couple of different reasons. One, because I worked with children. I was a therapeutic counselor with abused children. So that gave me a certain rage about the issue. Two, I grew up in a place where most of my friends came from broken and sometimes extremely violent homes. I did not. Yet I grew up economically on the same baseline. So when I left the neighborhood, I went to college, I did all these things that most of my friends didn't. And you begin to question, why did I make it out when they didn't, etc. The answer seemed pretty crystal clear in the end, was I came from a very sound family unit. I came from a very sound home. But we were loved, we were taken care of. So I saw just the ravages that child abuse causes on every level. I mean, which is what Gone Baby Gone's about. It's about every single level of it, from the most minor neglect to killing a child. And it just became a fascination. Now, after a certain point, your fascinations can become exploitation. With Shutter Island, I didn't intend going in to write a book about it, but there was a case where a woman in Texas had killed all her children, drowning them in the bathroom one by one, and I saw the husband on the news, and I just thought, how do you live with that? How do you walk around with that? All your kids are dead. Did you feel like you saw warning signs? I mean, you couldn't help it. And so that's what sort of, if you know Shutter Island ultimately, you could see it looking backwards. You can't see it coming into that book. Now, I got to the end of Shutter Island and I just said, whatever that line is between calling attention to an issue or investigating an issue and exploiting it for cheap sales and cheap thrills, I'm not over it, but I seem to be floating within the neighborhood. I've done it enough times, and so I stepped back. The underpinning of all noir, certainly American crime fiction, there is a somewhat distasteful mythology that ultimately can be stripped down to might equals right. Solve the problem with a gun. And the Kenzie books, as they got deeper and deeper, began to really question that. I didn't set out to do it. It just sort of happened organically. The older I grew, the more I began to question whether any good ever comes of any violence. So, to turn against the genre of literary fiction is not to say that there's something wrong with literature. It's that there was a certain subgenre that seemed to be a very excessively self-absorbed, navel-gazing type of fiction, often set in academia, often set with yuppies suffering from malaise and well-appointed kitchens in Connecticut, and I think some of us rebelled against it, and some of us who maybe had the skill set to work there, we said, I really like telling stories a little bit more. Plot was a dirty word when I was coming up in college. You didn't discuss it in writing classes. So I think there was a lot of us who rebelled against that, and we're also lucky enough to come up when there was a renaissance going on in crime fiction, certainly, with James Lee Burke and James Ellroy and James Crumley, the Jameses. If Black Dahlia is not one of the great novels of the 1980s, what is? Just because it's a mystery, does that mean it's, And that, I think, began to sort of rattle walls and rattle that box that we'd been put in. So people had lit the way for us a little bit. There was a torch ahead of us, and we just kind of followed it. If any book in my canon questions the very underpinnings of American crime fiction, it's Mystic River, because what it is it's a sort of dismantling of the central tenets of American crime fiction. And one of those is the lone wolf who goes against society to right the wrongs that society will not right. And my question is, what if he's wrong? That's what the book, I took the classic noir hero, and I said, what if he's wrong? What if he takes all of the circumstantial evidence. He goes running up the hill because he's sure he's right, and the punchline is he's wrong. That's one of the myths that we cling to hardest of all in this culture is if we're right, all collateral damage is acceptable. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not even remotely acceptable. I would rather be right, and I'd rather take an extra month or an extra 2 months to figure that out, because that's exactly what our founding fathers figured out when they came up with the justice system that they did. So that's what Mr. Griver says. The law of the street might feel satisfying in the moment, but the law of the street is bullshit. And there's a reason we trust courts, and there's a reason we trust, rule of law. So I grew up in Dorchester, yes, but my household was more like 1940s Ireland. And even the bars that I would go to with my dad when I was a kid were predominantly Irish. They'd get in arguments over, this is a Cork bar, that's a Galway bar, can't trust them, they're from Dublin. Everything was carried over. So, and I think that's the other wonderful thing I love about, I grew up in an immigrant culture, and I love immigrant cultures. I think that's the base of America. And so, like, my neighborhood now is Cambodian. And I bet it's wonderful to be a Cambodian in it right now. I do. I think it must be really cool. It's probably not cool to be Irish there anymore, so they moved. But it must be really cool to be Cambodian or Laotian or Vietnamese right now in that area. And you're seeing your customs meet assimilation. And as long as it happens in an organic way, I think that's a pretty cool journey to go on. At the end of the day, what I feel as an Irishman, where I feel my Irish, is I have a very strong mistrust of anybody who either A, at a government level tells me they're working from a moral reason, and that's a lie. B, any mistrust of anybody who presents themselves as royalty or being my superior. Irish people don't like royalty. They don't like it at all. Talk about taxation without representation. They took our language. You know what I mean? So we're a culture where it was illegal to speak our mother tongue, a mother tongue that my mother grew up speaking. So I think that you walk into a situation now where when somebody says, trust your whoever, I think there's a lot of us in this in Irish culture who go, no, that's not going to be happening. That's absolutely not going to be happening. And so I think those two together create the Irish American. When Sean Devine and Jimmy Marcus were kids, their fathers worked together at the Coleman candy plant and carried the stench of warm chocolate back home with them. It became a permanent character of their clothes, the beds they slept in, the vinyl backs of their car seats. Sean's kitchen smelled like a fudgicle, his bathroom like a Coleman choo-choo bar. By the time they were 11, Sean and Jimmy had developed a hatred of sweets so total that they took their coffee black for the rest of their lives and never ate dessert. On Saturdays, Jimmy's father would drop by the Devines to have a beer with Sean's father. He'd bring Jimmy with him, and as one beer turned into 6, plus 2 or 3 shots of Dewar's, Jimmy and Sean would play in the backyard, sometimes with Dave Boyle, a kid with girls' wrists and weak eyes who was always telling jokes he'd learned from his uncles. From the other side of the kitchen window screen, they could hear the hiss of the beer can pull tabs, bursts of hard, sudden laughter, and the heavy snap of Zippos as Mr. Devine and Mr. Marcus lit their Luckies.
I have never come across an ordinary person in my life. I don't know what an ordinary person is. Every human being seems to me totally mysterious, totally enigmatic. And maybe that's what makes me a writer. It's possible that the black books, it's possible that the books by Benjamin Black are exploring at least some of the themes that Banville does. I don't have many themes. I'm a limited person. Even though I've divided myself in two, which has probably made me even more limited than I was, diluting myself. I work in darkness, as all artists do. We think we're surrounded by resplendent light, but actually we're struggling through darkness. I don't know what I'm doing. When I was young, I thought I was in control of everything. I thought that every word that I wrote was pre-planned and that I could account for it. The older I got, the more I realized that writing is much more like the process of dreaming than it's like doing mathematics. Banville is engaged on very modest task of transforming the novel. I want to, my novels are highly poeticized. Now again, this puts people off. They think moon and June and love and dove and so on. And, what Banville tries to do with his books is to make them at that level of poetic intensity in prose that you have to concentrate. You take it or leave it. Remarkably, many people leave it, but some do stay. You know, I like to think that my books have that kind of poetic intensity. But again, poetic in a very special sense. I mean, they're about life. They're not transcendent, as I said at the start. They're about mundane things. But mundane things observed in such a way that, and with such an intensity of concentration, and such an intensity of language, that the most ordinary events begin to glow. You know, you can describe a pebble in the road, and if you describe it with enough passion, the thing will begin to glow. The object almost blushes. It sort of says, look, I wasn't supposed to be noticed in this way. But the artist said, yes, you're being noticed in that way now. Give of everything you can. It's almost a sexual exchange between the artist and the object. And that's what I want to get on the page, that passionate intensity, with which we do look at many things in the world. We don't spend our days looking at the pebble in the road with passionate intensity. But, you know, a novel is a very specific aspect of life. It looks like life, it feels like life, it tastes like life, if it's well enough done, but it's nothing like life. Life is this big incoherent thing that we wallow through. You know, we don't remember our birth. Wittgenstein says death is not an experience in life, which I think is true. All we have is this middle stuff. We've no beginning, no end. We just have all this chaos in the middle. Whereas a work of art is a finished, polished object. It's this burnished thing. That's why we go to it. As Frank Kermode, the great critic, says in the title of one of his books, The Sense of an Ending. We go to art for the sense of an ending and the sense of a finished thing. And that's what I try to make. Benjamin Black is engaged in a simpler process. Not simpler to do, but it's a simpler process that he is taking stories out of life, taking superficial things, but superficial in the best sense of the word, as Nietzsche says, on the surface. That's where the real depth is. So, you know, even though Black is describing things from the outside, because it's in third person, and almost all of Banville's books are in first person, so it has to be superficial. But then even the first person novelist has to be superficial as well, because all I know of the world is the surfaces of things. You know, I see your surface, I don't know what's going on in your mind. And even if you and I were to fall in love and have this wonderful, you know, 3 or 4 years that love lasts, you know, and be absolutely as one, we would both know in the watches of the night that we know almost nothing about each other. You know? So, you know, surfaces is what we work with. It's what all artists work with. When word got about that Richard Jewell had been found with the greater part of his head blown off and clutching a shotgun in his bloodless hands, few outside the family circle, and few inside it either, considered his demise a cause for sorrow. Jewell, known to the jauntier among his detractors as Diamond Dick, had been a wealthy man. The bulk of his money he had inherited from his father, the notorious Francis T. Francie Jewell, sometime Lord Mayor and proprietor of a highly successful newspaper chain that included the scarless and much-feared Daily Clarion, the city's top-selling paper. The older Jewell had been something of an uncut stone, given to violent vendettas and a loathing of trade unions. But his son, though no less unscrupulous and vengeful, had sought to polish the family name to a high luster by means of well-publicized acts of philanthropy. Richard Jewell was known for his sponsorship of orphanages and schools for the handicapped, while the recently opened Jewell wing of the Hospital of the Holy Family was in the vanguard of the fight against tuberculosis. These and other initiatives should have made Dick Jewell a hero in a city beset by poverty and chronic ill health. But now that he was dead, many among the citizenry declared themselves ready to dance on his grave. I would melt if I rested. When people say to me, when do you write? I say I write 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I write when I'm asleep. Everything pours into the blender. Everything is material. There's a famous incident between my wife and me when we were together first. many years ago, and we were having one of those, we were driving somewhere, we were having one of those arguments that you have in your first years together, where you're each molding each other, you know, trying to find a fit. And she was in wonderful, full rhetorical flight, telling me what a swine I was and what a monster I was. And I was enthralled by this, and I said to her, can I use that? And she said, you're even more of a monster than I thought you were. I said, yes, but can I use it? And of course she said, oh, all right. That's what writers do. We use everything. We're cannibals. We eat everything around us. Nothing passes us by. You could put it in a more positive way, a more charitable way, and say that, you know, as Thomas Hardy said, he wanted to be remembered as someone who noticed such things. And that's what we do. We notice everything. We notice absolutely everything. Nothing passes by. Now, it may well be that everybody notices everything. It may well be that we have nothing special. It's just that we record it and use it as material. I remember once talking with a friend of mine and saying something about my view of things. And he said, you haven't got a special view of things. You just have the knack of writing down what we see. We all see it. He said, don't imagine you're special. Don't imagine you're seeing special things. And it was a very good thing to be told. You know, every writer should be told this at least once a year. You're not special. You know, you just happen to have a way of expressing, but we all see the same things. Mind you, I don't believe a word of it, but anyway. that was just my humble act, you know. I've said many times that I hate my Banville books, and it's true, but I also add the important qualification that they're better than everybody else's. They're just not good enough for me, okay? They are necessary. You know, all works of art fail. As Beckett says, all we can do is fail again, fail better. It's like the infinitesimal calculus. One gets nearer and nearer and nearer to perfection. One will never get there, but that's the quest, that's the obsession, to try to make the perfect sentence, perfect paragraph, perfect chapter, the perfect book. Of course it's impossible. But you know, every time I start a book, I just finished a John Banville book a few weeks ago. I'm now starting a new one. I am absolutely convinced that this new one will be the greatest book that the world has ever known. It will set the world back on its heels in amazement. It's such an achievement. Rationally, I know it'll be another botched job, just like all the others. But, you know, again, there's two parts of me. You know, I have to, in order to start, in order to keep on, because I'm embarking on what will be 2, 3, 4, 5-year project. That's a long project. I remember Seamus Heaney saying to me once that, you know, he really had great admiration for novelists because he said, you know, you can produce a volume of poetry and there can be 3 poor or even bad poems and it won't ruin the book. He said 3 bad chapters in a book, in a novel, will ruin it. So we have to, you know, it is a huge undertaking. So in order to get myself started on that undertaking, I have to work on the basis that this will be a masterpiece. Well, I know it won't be. But if I didn't dislike my books, I have great suspicion of any writer who likes his own work. I have to dislike it. Otherwise, I wouldn't keep going on. I mean, if I got to a point where I thought I've achieved it, then I would stop. And then what would I do? My wife says, you go into politics, and then we'd all be doomed. The world is round, but language is square. And trying to fit them together is very, very difficult indeed. It continues to be difficult. Language is always elusive. It doesn't fit reality. It's a bad fit. And the closer we push it, it's like pushing 2 magnets together. The more they repel each other. So it never becomes easy. I am an Irish writer in that I write in what we call Hiberno-English. Irish English is as different from English as American English is, or Australian English, or Canadian English, or Indian English. It's a very specific form of English. You see, the Irish language itself, which we lost, you know, 150, 200 years ago, is a very oblique language. It's very, I often think of it as a mode of evasion rather than of communication. Very poetic language, very beautiful language. As far away from English as you could possibly get. And when basic English, which is very like, say, the Latin of the Roman Empire, because basic English was designed for an empire. So it's, you know, designed to command, to narrate, to make straightforward declarative sentences. When that was imposed on the sensibility that had been brought up in the Irish language, and even still, that sensibility is there. That created a new kind of language, new kind of English that is unique to us. So in that sense, of course, I'm an Irish writer. The accent in every word that I write is Irish. It has to be. But I don't like playing the Irish card. I don't like saying, aren't I wonderful, you know, I'm Irish. I don't like that. I think that we should be cosmopolitan. I think that an artist lives in the world at large, or should at least try to. But of course we can't. We use what we have. But it's extraordinary, and I mean, it's truly remarkable that some of the greatest Irish writers lived their adult lives outside Ireland. Oscar Wilde was essentially an English playwright. Yeats wanted to be an English poet until he realized that Ireland was his subject. You know, he cared no more about Ireland than he did about Man in the Moon, but it was a way of making poetry. Joyce left Ireland, Beckett left Ireland, never came back. So, you know, the Ireland that they write about is a thing that they invented in their heads. For us, now, what's the point of going away? For us, exile is staying in Ireland. We're internal exiles. And I like that.